like to welcome you all to this talk on field perspectives and violence in Mexico and Venezuela, sponsored by the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. It's my pleasure to present both of the speakers. I'm Austin Long. I'll be moderating. The procedure will be after they'll talk, I think fairly briefly, maybe half hour, 45 minutes total. The rest of the time for discussion and question and answer. Please come up, because we are recording this, please come up to the microphone to ask your questions, and we'll go from there. So first, let me present to my immediate left Jonathan Kalaher, who's a senior consultant in control risk, crisis, and resilience practice. I won't read his full bio, in part because he's a good friend, and I'm not gonna embarrass him with all the cool stuff he's done. But John is a former Ranger platoon leader. He has experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan. After getting his master's degree at Tufts University, he went on to work for the New York Police Department's Intelligence Division, and then he subsequently went to control risks. And then further to the left is Dave Danelo, who's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Dave is an expert on the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly based on his long experience there. He spent 18 months traveling back and forth on the border in 2007 and then in 2009, 2010. So he's the author of several books on that. He's also a former Marine with experience in Iraq, several tours there, where he received a Purple Heart and Commendation for Valor. And he's also a very good friend. So it's my great pleasure to present them. John will start, and then we'll move on to Dave, and then we'll move to question and answer. So
you have to stand,
do whatever you want. Great.
First off, Austin and Columbia University, thank you very much for having us. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. So this is what I do on a weekly basis. I work with companies that are assessing their vulnerabilities and their threats globally. Today we're going to cater to violence in Latin America, but please do feel free to ask the provoking questions. I know that you will. I've sat in several of Austin's classes in the past, and I've been incredibly impressed with the student response and the questions that you do ask. So please feel free to stop me and ask questions. I'm planning on speaking for about 10 or 15 minutes and running you through the presentation that I work with clients. And let me just take one step back. I work for Control Risks, and we are a security consulting company. And what I'm responsible for is the pre-incident kidnap and ransom training for organizations for the Americas. So North America all the way down to Argentina. Spent quite a bit of time in Latin America, and currently, just by the very fact that my clients need it, I'm in Mexico twice monthly, we'll say. So I don't necessarily have the strongest academic grasp of violence in Latin America. My formal education, undergrad, and then at Fletcher School at Tufts was in South Asian affairs, really. But what I do have is a pretty solid understanding of what is worrying clients today, and a granular and anecdotal understanding of the issues that they are facing or they have faced. So with that, slide please. How did I find control risk? And I think it's a pretty interesting story, because I was sitting in your shoes not that long ago with one of my peers at the Fletcher School, and he owned one of the largest shipping companies in Venezuela. And we did distance ed while at Fletcher, and we were in Boston. He showed up for the start of the semester, and we were talking. I said, you know, Andres, how are things going? He said, I'm really troubled. You know, my best friend was just kidnapped, and they'd been close friends for 30 or 40 years. He said, we haven't heard from him, and this was 7 weeks after he had been kidnapped. So we finished our master's. 11 months later, he came to New York City, and we had dinner down in the village. I said, you know, Andres, I'm just curious, what happened to Herman? He said, well, funny you should ask. 9 days ago, he was released after his 344 days in captivity. I said, that's interesting. I said, and what happened during that time? He said, you know, I felt so vulnerable during the incident. I felt I had to do something. So Andres flew from Caracas out to Bogota, met with then Defense Minister, now President Santos, And in that meeting was one of the U.S.'s FBI legal attaché, and also some of our consultants who were managing this case, and said, I was really impressed with the organization. You should check it out. So I went through the alumni network, contacted my predecessor who hired me on and really put me in position today to talk about these things. But what found me my job was a violent incident in Latin America, a kidnapping in Caracas, Venezuela, that lasted 344 days, and by all estimates, the settlement was somewhere in the vicinity of $3 to $4 million. I'll take you through some of our proprietary slides. Please ask the questions. We do have analysts that sit in London that compile this information for us. The only reason I'm showing it, we were not going to use any kind of presentation, but Austin and Ingrid both said it might be interesting to the participants because you may not have seen it. But again, please push me on these. And then some of these are just things that I feel comfortable talking about if this is the way we want to take the discussion. Slide, please, Austin. Slide. If you looked at Kidnap for Ransom almost a decade ago, you'd see that 2/3 of all kidnappings were happening in Latin America. Now it's really a global problem. It doesn't mean that Kidnap for Ransom is decreasing in Latin America. Absolute terms, it has increased. All this means is it has become more of a global threat. Slide. The cases that our consultants worked in 2010, and within Control Risk, we have 15 response consultants. They are the negotiators. So if you're familiar with the movie Proof of Life, Russell Crowe and Meg Ryan came to London to sit with our folks back before that movie was made to see how it plays out. And much of it was accurate. Obviously Hollywood took some liberties in catering it to them to make it a highly profitable movie, but much of it was accurate. And as far as the global marketplace, we respond to about somewhere between 70 and 75% of all kidnappings globally that have some kind of corporate flavor, meaning the corporation assumes liability and responsibility for the individual that was kidnapped. Now, some of these times, the family may say, I understand it's an employee, you may want, I understand you, employer, may want to help, but I don't want that assistance. That does not factor into these cases. We only respond when the client needs it. And you'll see I tallied up, and almost half of our cases last year were in Latin America. And the 64 in Mexico, I think, is really telling. Business is booming. Slide. In the 35-year history, almost 2,000 cases. Slide. I pulled these out. And what I think is interesting here, the statistics are less important than the trends. And if you look at Colombia, which tops that list, from 2001 through 2007, you'd see about 90% of those kidnappings happen in that time frame. Since 2008 onwards, you've almost seen it become insignificant in parts of Colombia, mostly because the government has done a fantastic job rooting it out and making it a non-issue. What we have seen is elements from Colombia have gone cross-border into Panama and Venezuela and targeted folks there. Bringing back to that anecdote that I started off with, my friends, with Andres' friend Herman, they assessed that the FARC was tied to that kidnapping in Caracas, and mostly just because of the operational understandings. The first contact with the family wasn't for 7 or 8 weeks after. The infrastructure that they had to support him, to hold him for almost a year, to feed him, and by his accounts, care for him very well. So we have seen this rise cross-border. For Mexico, last count last year, they're guessing that 90% of all kidnappings are not reported. It's underreported. Media is getting fatigued there. And then the government does not want to disclose that it is a problem. They still want people to come to Mexico. So the 2,500 is not accurate. Venezuela, what we see largely, express kidnapping has really become significant business for folks in Venezuela, many times complicit with the local police authorities. And then Brazil. I was just speaking with our colleague here before class, and she had a close friend that was kidnapped for 3 months in Brazil. We're seeing less of that. Currently in Brazil, kidnappings are a couple days in duration, but we are seeing what we see is, and call express kidnappings, where they're holding them for 24, 48, 72 hours, maxing out their debit cards and then sending them on their way. But what can we take of this? For the last decade, 4 of the top 10 globally are Latin American countries. And it's an indicator that it is a significant issue there. Slide. Just where we went, 2009, 2010, slide. 93% of kidnappings worldwide are locals. And this is, there's a stark contrast between what we're seeing globally and then what we're seeing in Mexico. In Mexico, fewer than 2% of the hostages that are taken are nationals. And many of those times, many of the 2%, it's a case of mistaken identity. It's a Central American, it's a Guatemalan that they're believing is a Mexican, and they're picking them up. What we have seen is the cartels are diversifying their portfolio. They're not looking at drug and arms trafficking, but they're seeing that this is financially viable method to continue to fund their activity in Mexico. So they're picking people up. They don't want to pick up foreign nationals that essentially don't want to bring undue pressure on themselves. Slide. Durations known to us, vast majority of the time, it's less than a week. Again, we'll use Mexico as an example. Last year for 2010, average duration was about 4 days. The maximum case that we worked was 15 days. Now, you might ask about Diego Martí, who was the one-time presidential candidate that was held for the better part of 7 months. And that's the outlier. There was a $50 million demand. But most of these kidnappings that we're seeing are taking less than a week in time. Slide. Victim outcomes, again, contrast what we're seeing globally with Mexico. 4% globally, somewhere between 9 and 11% in Mexico. A lot of those are revenge kidnappings, so it's cartel on cartel. You kidnapped and killed my spouse, daughter, cousin, I'm going to do the same to you. Slide. Slide. I had a video, I'll show that later. Kidnapping, extortion specific to Mexico. And again, please feel free to ask me about Latin America. It is a problem in Latin America, but my expertise really right now is on Mexico because that's where I am constantly. Slide. 1,200 kidnappings reported in 2010. Again, they're guessing that it was somewhere tenfold of that. Slide. The demands give you a good snapshot of what we're seeing for requests, both in 2009 and 2010. Slide. The victims, high profile. Case that I'm pretty familiar with is a local government official in Monterey that had her 20-year-old college student son that was kidnapped by ostensibly Los Zetas cartel and held for several days, beaten up pretty badly, quite grisly as far as how they brutalized his chest with a knife, just hacking him up. He was able to escape, but what we are seeing is to insert or assert political influence. They are kidnapping high-profile individuals in Mexico. Slide. Durations in Mexico. I already talked about this. Slide.
Could you go back a bit?
Yes, please go up one.
On the objectives, money versus
Go up.
Influence.
On.
I thought you said from that
Yeah.
side that some of the people, especially the hope from my profile, were being kidnapped not for money but to gain influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. Thank you. For some of the cartels, for them to make a statement, they're kidnapping and killing either politicians, police officials, or family members thereof. I think the case in Nuevo Laredo, when the police chief that stepped up said, you know, I want to do a lot for this town. I'm willing to do it. And then within a few days, they killed him. It, by no means is an outlier. We're seeing several of these cases. And again, it's not just the kidnapping on that. That wasn't a kidnapping. They straight up killed him. But some of these, they're playing on the emotions of the family and try to get them to coalesce and say, I'll let you operate here and I won't fight your policy. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you actually work within the situation? Because you talk about settlements, and it would be too easy to conclude that the resolution of a kidnapping for ransom would just be paying the money and moving on with your life. The following slide talked about surprise and about police action. Can you talk a little bit about negotiation, or maybe how you work with police forces, or if you have like contractors that you work with to do physical things?
No. Great question. So we're consultants. We don't, you know, there's no action arm of what we do. Those days are far behind me. So the way that it works is, as an organization, and this will be the Cliff's Notes version, but thanks for asking that. Most people don't want to hear it. That's why I didn't address it. But so what happens is, client calls and says, I think I had an incident. You know, we do some initial fact finding, say, answer these 15 questions and get back to us once you have some more reliable intelligence. Once we say it's probable or even reasonable to assume that an individual was kidnapped, we'll put them on a plane from London. In that interim, from H hour until that consultant gets there, we'll have someone like myself that will work with the organization for the first 12, 24 hours, however long it takes. For Mexico, depending upon flight availability, it's probably going to take somewhere between 18 and 24 hours to get from London there. So we'll work with them for the first 24 hours, assisting them in whatever capacity they really need, as far as working, you know, with any kind of media problems that they may have. If it's out, generally it's not, and what we try to say is don't put it in the media. Working with the family, trying to tell them, you know, you may not necessarily want to go to the police now. But we also, to that point, specifically, we will work with, you know, federal level police in Mexico. Most of the time, Mexico specific we'll use, and it varies by country. We will have a relationship with federal police authorities that we do believe are not corrupt. There's over 2,000 independent police forces in Mexico alone. We don't know who to trust. We've had 64 cases there last year. We know at the federal level who we can co-opt and work through. So we will do that. So it's highly scenario dependent as far as what we do and how we respond and who we work with. And then we'll stay there. We'll have 2 consultants tasked to that case for the duration of the negotiation. And they go on and off a rota schedule every 21 days. So 21 days, it's actually, they back off about 48 hours so that they have that proper transition. So at the 19-day mark, the second consultant will come in and relieve the first, send him out, and they'll stay on that rota schedule for the duration thereof. You know, the one very public case that has been written about and we've been mentioned, I feel I can disclose, was the Northrop Grumman case that lasted 5.5 years. And our consultants, we had 2 consultants that worked that case for 5.5 years. It was the same 2 gentlemen that managed that case from our end. Did that answer your question, John? Yeah. Slide, please. Slide. Extortion trends. The extortion issue in Mexico is becoming particularly vexing from a practitioner standpoint because it's so pervasive. We're seeing cartels that have, and it's understandably so, they've done a good job of scaring people into saying, hey, for $150,000, I have no problem paying them and sending them on their way. Otherwise, they're going to kill my entire family. The problem is they're not going on their way. They'll make a $150,000 extortion demand that will quickly become a $400,000 extortion demand that will quickly become $1 million demand, and it will cause the business to shut down. So it's highly problematic for us, and really we're seeing it almost on a daily basis. And it's underreported because many of them will just pay at first blood. Yeah, please, Priya.
Are you, as a consultant, doing the negotiation with the kidnappers?
No.
Or are you, who is the middleman in between that? Like, how do you get contact?
Yeah. So we're never the negotiator. Our role is to serve as the coach and not the player. And we're more effective that way, where we can take a step back and look at things strategically, see where the company wants to go. The organization will pick someone that negotiates, and we call that person the communicator. And they are the voice of the organization. And it's going to be someone that's not in a position of power within the organization, but a couple layers removed, where they say, I can't make decisions. I can ask my boss for the decision, but I don't have the authority to make a decision on my own. So that's how we work with them, and we never deviate from that. Is a negotiator always going to be an employee? No, sometimes it may go to the family, but what you want to do, what we try to do, is funnel it so that they know that there's only one client. If it goes to a negotiation, it's a very good thing. They're probably not going to kill the employee, spouse, whoever it is, because it means that they want money. They want to negotiate something. Most of the time that they are killed, it's a kidnap for execution. They're kidnapping them. They're never making contact, and they're killing the individual. They understand, don't want any money, I'm going to kill this person. So if it does come to negotiation, it's very positive from our perspective. Slide. Our forecast, listen, Mexico isn't Afghanistan or Iraq. And this is what we do convey to our clients, nor is Latin America. I've been over much of Latin America, and Latin America is not Afghanistan or Iraq. You can't operate there. But it does take some prior planning and risk mitigation and understanding of the potential impact to do it well. What we're seeing is most organizations understand this, and they're doing this. Slide. Yes, please. Sure. You're right. Case studies, 2010, what we saw, dependents, locals most at risk, somewhere 2 to 3%. 3% is erring on the high side, being quite conservative. It's really about less than 2%. Slide. Case studies, Reynosa, what we're seeing is common thugs in Mexico are saying that they're tied to these cartels. And it's so that they can command top dollar for the kidnap, for the extortion. Happened in Reynosa on the border. Individual got picked up by what he thought was a couple at 5:30 in the morning, held for 7 hours, said that he saw 7 executions, and then they released him for the equivalent of $120. These cartels are multi-million-dollar organizations. I mean, is it reasonable to expect that they'd release someone for $120? In my mind, it's not. I spoke about the Monterey case. Guerrero, Michoacan, that extortion threat that was somewhere along the lines of $180,000 extortion demand to stop their operations. They said, you're going to pay us $180,000 and I also want you to shut down operations here. What they want to do from their perspective, what the family's assessment was, is they employed a lot of the local agriculture workers. And what they assessed, and again, this is what a client assessed, said, we think they want us to shut down so that they can pull from our pool of employees so that they can recruit. It's interesting. How reasonable is it? I don't know. We weren't ever able to determine what happened. They ended up paying the $180,000 and didn't shut down the operation, and they didn't get re-hit for any additional money. So I guess to be determined on that one. Slide, please. Should I field questions now, Austin, or turn it over to Dave and then?
No, let's turn it over to Dave, and then we'll do questions after.
Great.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks.
Slide up to. Thank you for having me. I'm David Danelo, up from Philadelphia, senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I would say I'm an expert in, I have a background in the Marine Corps, but I'm an expert in the U.S.-Mexico border, international border analysis, and field research. And to talk more about field research and the way it relates to Latin America and the Latin American context, can we go to the beginning of the presentation? Yeah, just back up. We'll just work there. So let me get a feel for where we are. Raise your hand if you've traveled in Latin America. That's what I expected. Now raise your hand if you've been to Mexico City. Also, usually kind of the starting point, obviously, for understanding Mexico and Mexico's relationship with the United States. Raise your hand if you've traveled on the U.S.-Mexico border. Okay, also expected. Raise your hand if you've been to Chihuahua City, Hermosillo, or Ciudad Obregón. That's also what I expected. That's one of the things that has become relevant in understanding the way that not just U.S.-Mexico relations have evolved, but U.S.-Latin American relations have evolved, is understanding more about the fault line between the United States and Latin America's evolution over the past probably 15 or 20 years, which really is northern Mexico. Next slide. Do we have the facts slide up? Did that get pulled in? We missed it.
Northern Mexico?
Northern Mexico facts. Oh, there it is. Oh, it looks prettier. Thanks.
It's mutated.
Sorry about that. It's now property of control risks. So, let me speak in greater detail to the facts and what makes northern Mexico distinctive. Northern Mexico, 6 states. Those 6 states come up against the United States on the 4 states of the U.S.-Mexico border. 85% of all U.S.-Mexico trade either originates from northern Mexico or flows through those ports of entry. So it's significantly economically connected and very economically important to the United States. It obviously now is the home of 55 to 65, roughly between 55 and 60% of the drug-related violence that Mexico's seeing and the drug-related killings. Specifically, 87% of Mexico's maquiladora manufacturing. 25% of Mexico's 111 million residents. That statistic has doubled since NAFTA. That's important to understand because the degree of connectivity that NAFTA created between northern Mexico and the United States and the robust growth that was generated in northern Mexico is often underappreciated. How many of you have been to Monterrey? Anybody in South Texas? It's south of South Texas, about 5 hours from Houston. Monterrey and Houston, the standard of living is at one point was nearly identical. Over the past year and a half, particularly, it's come under siege. And that's important in terms of understanding the geopolitics of northern Mexico and the violence in Latin America as a whole in our response to it. Other thing that's important is the U.S. has a huge diplomatic presence in Mexico. We have more consulates, embassies, and posts in Mexico than any other country in the world. It's tied with China right now. It's actually one more than China, and 2 or 3 more than Canada. But those are our 3 largest trading partners, which is why we're so connected. There's 7 consulates specifically in those 6 states in northern Mexico. Next slide. I have, let's back up to the geography slide. So what I've got now is I've got 4 maps that we'll talk to and that I'd like to use to frame our question and answer session. First, let's just take a look at Mexico and the geography of it. Mexico is so mountainous that if it were flattened, it would be the size of Asia. Most people don't appreciate the character of Mexico's mountains and how that jagged terrain defines the scope of Mexico, particularly in the north. Let's just take a look at that, kind of working our way from west to east, and we'll keep doing that as we go through these slides. So Baja California, obviously, it's an isthmus, and mostly defined by its mountains and its coasts. And then as we move into Sonora, there's that huge expanse of desert broken up by the Sierra Madre Occidentals, which stretch all the way down to Mexico City. 3 mountain ranges in Mexico: Sierra Madre Occidentals, Orientals, and Del Sur in the south. And then moving into Chihuahua, Chihuahua actually has 3 different geographic regions. It's mountains, steppes, plains, and desert. That West Texas desert and Chihuahuan desert, back before there was a border, vaqueros and cowboys crossed it routinely, and they still do. And interestingly enough, even after the U.S.-Mexico border was defined, the border's most stable period, does anybody know when it was? When the U.S.-Mexico border was the most stable in history, in the history of its existence from 1848 to today? It was actually from 1876 until just before the Porfiriato ended. And I know that there's a lot of unpleasantries that occurred during the Porfiriato, to say the least. But one of the interesting things that evolved from 1876 to just before 1910 was an agreement between the U.S. and Mexican governments where they could patrol the border jointly. And Mexican rurales routinely rode with Texas Rangers and American soldiers. And there were a number of joint efforts that took place that served to stabilize a lot of the banditry that had characterized the border up until that time, and then continued to in the wake of the Mexican Revolution, and then through the 50s and 60s, and into the various iterations of the border today. We can talk in more detail on that in the Q&A, but it's a very interesting period of time where there was a strong degree of cooperation between the United States and Mexico. Continuing to move east, let's go with the next slide, the population density. As the population of that northern Mexico region, as we can see, pretty empty. Starts to get a little bit more dense as we move east. One of the reasons behind that, next slide, is the character of the Rio Grande. Most people don't realize the Rio Grande actually starts in Mexico. It's most strongly influenced by a river called the Rio Conchos. There are 7 dams on the Rio Conchos where the headwaters are in the Chihuahua, in western Chihuahua, in the Sierra Madre Orientals. And the flow of it, without those 7 dams, flows and surges just right around Big Bend National Park, where Ojinaga and Presidio are, is where the Rio Grande really picks up steam. North of that, it's almost a different river. And when you travel the border and you can see that, and you see the change that it takes where the Conchos flows in, you almost want to call that the northern Rio Grande and rename the river entirely, because there are 2 dams north of that where the Rio Grande, as we call it, actually starts in Colorado. But from that point north, you can actually just walk across it. Anybody been to El Paso? You know exactly what I'm talking about. The Rio Grande is basically a creek, and you can stroll back and forth at it at will if there wasn't a international border there. But this is important for understanding the character of the economics in South Texas and northeastern Mexico, because that's a river delta. And the same qualities that exist in any river delta, the Nile Delta, the Mekong, anywhere in the world, exist at the Rio Grande as well. Huge farming area, very fertile. It's a large basin. Next slide. And this will be my last one, and we'll talk to this a little bit more. So this is what the geopolitics of northern Mexico, in terms of how we develop U.S.-Mexico relations and U.S.-Mexico policy, and how we address a lot of the violence that's taking place in Latin America in general, and Mexico in particular. Normally, we focus culturally on Mexico City. Let me take a step back for a second and focus more culturally and geographically, economically, politically, and demographically to some degree, with each of these 3 regions specifically. In Baja California, 9 out of every 10 people live within 50 kilometers of the U.S.-Mexico border. And so the character of Baja California is very influenced by the economics between Tijuana and San Diego, very, very influenced culturally by Mexico's sensitivities towards the Baja Peninsula. The Baja Peninsula protects Mexico's, from a naval perspective, that guards Mexico's western flank. They were most aggressive, the Mexican government was most aggressive during negotiations that ended the Mexican-American War about getting the Baja Peninsula back. The United States had occupied it during the Mexican-American War, and there were a number of unhappy Marines and sailors that were evicted from Baja California and relocated to to San Diego, which was placed under martial law until 1850 because they had large tracts of land that they had seized and did not want to give them back to the Mexican government in Baja California. So Mexico City is very sensitive about maintaining control and not giving that up to Alta California. The Sierra Madres is, as we mentioned, very defined by the mountains and very defined by the character of cooperation with the United States over time. And interestingly enough, at a museum in Hermosillo, which is the capital of Sonora, the museum, the State History Museum, spoke of a degree of animosity towards Mexico City as though Mexico City kind of sold them out during the Mexican-American War. There were, I don't remember the exact number, I want to say maybe 20 or 30,000 people total that were forced to, there was a supply line that was cut off during the War of Independence from Spain in 1821. Throughout the 1820s, and they were forced to flee ranches and flee areas, and that area was not rebuilt during the years between Mexican independence from Spain and the Mexican-American War. And there's a belief, at least expressed by the exhibits in the State History Museum, that had Mexico City invested more time in taking care of Hermosillo and Sonora and the northern region, then they would have been able to defend against the Norteamericanos, and they would not have had their terrain violated, and that may have been more machismo than actual analysis, but it's there, and they do hold some degree of resentment towards Mexico City. The Rio Grande Basin is by far the most interconnected region to the United States. The ties between Monterrey and Houston, the business community, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, and it's so connected that the exhibit in the Museum of the Noreste in Monterrey celebrates their tie to Texas as though Texas was still part of northeastern Mexico. And the actual exhibits in the museum say that, well, you know, Texas was so successful economically throughout the 20th century because, well, they were tied to this economic revolution that began in the 1880s in northeastern Mexico, and so that laid the groundwork. That oil stuff, don't worry about that. That's not that big of a deal. But really, being part of northeastern Mexico is tremendous. It's important to understand the sensitivity that Mexico City has also to the business community in Monterrey. Monterrey is the wealthiest. It's the wealthiest city in Mexico per capita. So we might think of it as if New York were a third the size of Washington, D.C. in terms of the political and economic relationship between Monterrey and DF. And that's, again, a generalization, but a reasonably accurate one. There is a cultural distinction that's important to identify between Monterrey and DF, and that is that Monterrey, which is the capital of what I've described as the Rio Grande Basin, was not a native city. It was entirely founded by Europeans. So there was never a pre-existing city or pre-existing colony or pre-existing anything before España occupied the city and founded it. It was founded in 1538. So there's a very significant cultural distinction between the history of Monterrey, which then frames the perceptions and the cultural connections between the United States and specifically in South Texas and the Rio Grande, and DF, which, as we all know, has a long and painful and sordid history of any number of iterations from, but more specifically the tension between Montezuma and Cortés. That is a quick summary, a brief summary of that fault line between the United States and Mexico. With that, I'll sit down and I know that our conversation, our discussion revolves around violence in Latin America, violence in Mexico, and obviously the three of us all come from a perspective of, I think both of these gentlemen are much more academically credentialed than I am. I'm just a guy who likes to run around and look at things and write about them, and I've done a little bit of that in my time. But with that, thank you for your time, and
Great. Okay. I'll say a couple of words. Many of the trends that both John and Dave mentioned are present in other parts of Central and Latin America. I'm particularly thinking of the cell phone extortion calls that John mentioned from prisons. It's a major phenomenon in El Salvador and other parts of Central America. I don't think it's made quite as much inroad into Latin America, but I doubt that will be very far behind. So while we've talked a lot about Mexico in specific, I think that these are sort of broader phenomenon, and we can talk about these broader phenomenon if you want. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. If you would, come up to the mic since we are recording it, and we'll start there. And if nobody has a question, I'll think of some. Excellent.
Thank you very much for coming. Very interesting. My name is Idalia. I'm an alumni from Columbia University. I'm interested to hear your thoughts a little bit. As you know, Obama's in Latin America, and today he's in El Salvador, which has one of the highest murder rates. A quarter of the citizens have been victimized by crime. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about your thoughts on what is the role of the U.S. and international community, particularly in supporting the Central American region and addressing the issues of crime, the maras, and especially with the U.S. having a regional base there in El Salvador. Thank you.
I'll take a crack at it if you guys. Yeah. So I've been to Salvador a couple of times lately, most recently in December. The United States is providing a lot of support to Salvador. As you mentioned, there's a regional base there, but it operates from there throughout Central America. With Salvador, the U.S. role goes back in a major way 3 decades, but it sort of petered out a little bit in the 1990s and 2000s and has recently gone up. So the U.S. Has a major USAID program to try and build up local policing. They're FBI liaison. So they're doing a lot there. Other parts of Central America, the United States has even dispatched special forces teams to help build up border police capacity in Guatemala. So there's a lot of effort to do things. Now, Mexico, and probably Dave and John could speak to this, I think is a bit of a different case. Plan Colombia in Colombia was a bit contentious, but it was framed through counter-narcotics lens and happened even though it was really a counterinsurgency program. But it was still contentious. I think Mexico will be much more difficult simply because of the relationship it has to the United States to provide the kind of support that became routine with Plan Colombia and is still pretty routine in places like Guatemala and El Salvador. So maybe you guys could talk to support to Mexico.
I think, more to your question about Central America, there's some interesting events taking place in Panama as well that it will be interesting to see how that relates to El Salvador and some of the initiatives that Austin described. The standard phrase in any political circle now is capacity building, and obviously continuing to that's the standard boilerplate answer to your question, which I think Austin captured in more granular detail. Capacity building in Central America, I think, will be to make a generalization. It's going to be easier than capacity building in Mexico for a lot of reasons, which we can probably expand on in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think some people try to say that Mexico today is Colombia in 1985, and I don't think that you can simplify it like that. I do think Plan Colombia worked for a number of different reasons, and just, again, from my perspective, the clients that I work with don't have the faith in the infrastructure of Mexico that I think Colombians did in their police and military forces, and then even the government that helped execute it.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Thaxton. I'm a student at SIPA. My question sort of piggybacks on the last question, but has to do a little bit more specifically with the role of the U.S. military. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about possibilities for foreign internal defense in Mexico and what it should look like. I know that the Mexican Navy has been in the press of late as being a real competent branch of the Mexican military, but should we be training their army? Should we be looking at police forces? Do you think it's a good idea at all? Thank you.
I've got some thoughts.
Yeah, I know you.
Yeah, I'll take a lead. I'll take a lead on this one. You know, there's obviously. How many folks have read the WikiLeaks disclosures about Mexico specifically? Anyone?
Not that I'll admit to.
So I mean, it's fairly hidden in plain sight that there's some activity that's going on in Mexico that the United States military is involved in it. You know, at least it's been disclosed in WikiLeaks and that sort of thing. My broadest concern about this is, categorically speaking, we've got overt and covert activity. So it seems like the direction that our government has gone has been in partnership with the Mexican government, that there's been considerable interest on both sides in maintaining covert activity and in saying, okay, well, we're going to do capacity building, we're going to do, you know, foreign internal defense and these things, the Plan Colombia into Plan Mexico, and we have the Merida Initiative, and we have all this, but once we get down to brass tacks, in terms of whether it's taking on a high-value target or developing intelligence or anything that those of you who have Austin's classes study the tactics and operations of on a daily basis, that's what we're doing. What we don't have right now is an overt legal and diplomatic framework that governs and institutionalizes these relationships. So much of our activity with the Mexican government is built foundationally on personal relationships. One of those has been deteriorating for a while and collapsed this past weekend, as I'm sure most of you are familiar in the news with the Mexican, the U.S. ambassadors to Mexico's resignation. We got to work on that. We've got to work on developing and continuing to strengthen the overt process that we go through, and that requires going through, you know, both houses of Congress, both the Mexican, both the United States, and really getting consent from the U.S. and Mexican people as to, okay, are we going to establish zones along the U.S.-Mexico border where we cooperate, where we can do interdicting activity? Are we going to, you know, how are we going to institutionalize and maintain a extended period of cooperation that's going to last decades rather than work ourselves out of a job as we did in Plan Colombia?
Do you want to?
No, I mean, I guess to your second point, and this is just, I think you were getting at it, but the professionalism of the Mexican Army vis-a-vis the Marine Navy folks. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. I know George Grayson, who works with him, has said, you know, categorically that the Mexican Navy Marine folks have done a much better job of fighting internal corruption.
That's right.
And working in partnership, you know, with the non-corrupted police forces in Mexico. So I think you were making that point, and I'm just reiterating and confirming that I think that your assessment is right.
And I agree.
The other thing is, you know, I think there may be a knee-jerk response that is a bit within the U.S. to militarize these things. And not that the military can't be a good tool, but so much of the problem, and I'm going to sound like a little bit of a hippie, is at the governance level. You know, it's not that military force can't do certain things, but a lot of this is legal and institutional. So to take Salvador again, as a relic of the Civil War, until relatively recently, they had no wiretap law. So it's awfully hard to make cases against people making cell phone calls from prisons when you can't legally monitor phone conversations. So I think a lot of the problem are in institutional things like that. The other bit, and this is more speculative, again, based on some of my time in Salvador. So in Salvador, as they have in Mexico, as they did in Colombia, they've started deploying the army, again, in an internal security role. And that was verboten after the peace accord for a long time. they finally started doing that. Well, one concern a lot of Salvadorans have is that the army, which is very well respected now, it's taken really 20 years to get to that point, but they've sort of cleaned up human rights violations, professionalized, all these great things. There's a real concern that in leaving the barracks to go to the street, the corruption that has basically not touched the military to date is going to inevitably start seeping through the military. And I wonder a little bit if that's not a story of the Navy and the Marines who have been sort of on the coast and hanging out and not as deeply involved in this sort of day-to-day street-level stuff. I mean, yeah, they would do drug interdiction, so there's not that there was no chance for corruption. But I wonder if they've been a little insulated from pressure, and the more they get used in these kind of operations, the more that's a risk. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Other than, I agree. I'm the same, you know, Mexico's been wrestling with that since December 2006 when they said, okay, we're going to send the army in. It is a war. How do you prevent the army from being corrupt? And it's not a, you know, there's no universality to it.
Hi, my name is Nate Rawlings, and I'm a student here at SIPA 2. My question is about pre-violent incident prevention. Other than maintaining a strong security posture, have there been other techniques that have been proven successful, intelligence gathering or any other techniques to prevent violent incidents before they happen?
Yeah, great question. Well, you guys mind kick this one off? As far as what we're seeing from corporate America for mitigating factors is they're continuing to run operations, but when possible, a lot of organizations, or corporations rather, have moved any non-essential activities back cross-border, back to Texas. So many of these corporations that do have operations either along the border or Monterey also have some kind of operations in Laredo, in McAllen, in Harlingen, and they're pulling non-essential personnel back out. So what they're seeing is, yeah, it may be the man or woman is the local plant manager for whatever company, but do they necessarily need to be on site all the time? No, and they're going to be the people that are targeted, is what we're seeing. So what they're saying is, unless you absolutely have to go to the plant in Reynosa, Nuevo Laredo, Monterey, please stay on the U.S. side. So that's one thing that I've seen organizations do.
The flip side of that, unfortunately, is that when you pull the economic activity out of the area, then you have a large population of unemployed men aged 15 to 40 who are trying to feed their families.
Flores.
Right, and that's exactly what's happened in many of these areas, where very good for the client or good for the company, bad for the area.
Mr. Danelo, which was the only talk that I was able to attend, you suggested that Plan Colombia, and I think Mr. Long as well, has been a glaring success. But how would you be so optimistic about something that has been going on for, I think, 12 years, and sure, the coca leaves crop has been substantially reduced, but this is still in very high numbers. I don't remember the exact number. For me, the magical number is 100, but I don't remember if it is 100 tons or 100,000 pounds or kilos. But any number in that territory is still a very substantial. So I might quote, and I know that he's not very popular in the military or former military or cops community, Julian Assange. There is an interview of him in Semana, which is a Colombian weekly magazine this week, in which he says that it's been a big success, but for American contractors. And it brings, I mean, the academic that I am not, but there was a guy who won a Nobel Prize in economics in the 80s, mid-80s, called Buchanan, not Pat, of course, that actually he's more of a political scientist, and he, one of his main contributions to social science is about the power of bureaucracies to affect policy decisions. And in this case, it's not just bureaucracies, all the bureaucracies that are involved in the so-called, or in the war on drugs, all those acronyms, but also the business interests that call for keeping the war. That has, I mean, lastly, I want to quote more or less Nixon's remark in 1971, by which he praises the success of the recently initiated war on drugs. And according to him, the marijuana crop in Mexico, which was a big problem at that time, had already been solved, and there was a big success in the war on drugs, according to Richard Nixon, 40 years ago.
Let me just first, the distinction between, I didn't say Plan Colombia was a success. What I said was the strategic approach will be, I think, have to be vastly different than the United States took with Plan Colombia, and is, frankly, continuing to use, and that has been institutionalized in our relationship with Colombia. More to your point about the war on drugs and the never-ending or perpetual state of it, the Nixon Commission actually had the commission, every member of the commission recommended that marijuana be legalized, and Richard Nixon personally overturned that as part of when he did the war on drugs, or when he legislated the war on drugs. Let's do just a quick hand. So raise your hand if you think marijuana should be legalized. Raise your hand for cocaine, meth, heroin. Okay.
I'll just keep my libertarian hand up.
Right, there we go. So it's not, but the point, there's a pretty broad societal, I do this routinely whenever we have this conversation, because most people think that a former military guy would be extremely militant against, legalizing, and frankly, that's not my position at all. I think it's important that the laws that the United States has and that we're prosecuting reflect the will of the people. In my experience and observation, there does not seem to be a broad societal consensus on marijuana being an illegal narcotic. That just doesn't appear to exist. The politician who has most vocally addressed this issue, by the way, is former Marine Senator Jim Webb, who has recommended in a number of public forums that the United States accomplish a fairly robust reform of its justice system that includes taking a real hard look at decriminalizing marijuana. And he's been the strongest voice on that issue. And if those of you who are doing detailed research on it, take a look at a seminar and symposium that took place at George Mason University in October 2008. A lot of good stuff came out of that.
Do you want to? So the reason I say Plan Colombia is a success, as I sort of alluded to in my remarks, is a counterinsurgency effort, not as a counter-narcotics effort. Counter-narcotics at best in Colombia, even if when the numbers went down, they pushed it to other places. Overall, coca production has not really gone down. What it did do was enable a Colombian state that, as John sort of suggested, had some will but some lacking in ability to do things it wanted to do, like fight back against FARC. That's really where the success has come, is enabling a state that was looking a little shaky for a while to push the FARC back to increasing marginalization. And it did that by providing helicopters and training and all kinds of stuff. So that's why I suggest it was not so great as a counter-narcotics effort, but counter-narcotics was a way to make counterinsurgency aid happen. I mean, certainly prior to the Iraq War, counterinsurgency was still kind of a loaded term in the United States. Maybe it still is, depending on your perspective. But the point is, it was tough to sell U.S. counterinsurgency support to Colombia. It was pretty easy to sell counter-narcotics support. Now, the FARC made it easy for those selling it this way by being involved in the drug trade, but that's why I think Plan Colombia could be coded a success. I mean, as you saw by me keeping my hand up, I think the war on drugs is completely ridiculous. It's going to be a failure as long as there's demand in the United States. I mean, we have, you mentioned economics, basic economics. When the demand signal is this strong, it's going to be provided from somewhere. And whether it's meth labs in Western North Carolina, where I go see my mom, and like it's like, oh, another lab blew up, or whether it's the jungles in Colombia, it's going to be an issue. And a lot of that, just because of geography, as Dave sort of suggested, is going to flow through Mexico, and it's going to be a big issue there. So it's not that I think Plan Colombia, solved the drug problem. I think it did help solve the FARC problem.
My name is Ben Schwartz. I'm also a SIPA student. The Office of the President of Mexico recently released a database of the violence in Mexico that showed the rise that everyone was sort of expecting. And they blamed a lot of that on exports of arms from the U.S., but I didn't see any numbers of an increase of exports of arms. And there was recently that arrest in Arizona of law enforcement, I believe, that was exporting arms. I was wondering if you could speak on if there's been an increase in the export of arms and what role U.S. arms have in the capacity of criminal organizations.
Sure. Well, I heard this third hand, but strategically, Mexico's bet on the top 5 as a matter of national security with Iran, Iraq, Afghan, Pakistan. And from folks that I respect very well say that exactly what you're saying is at least equally problematic. As drugs flowing north is arms flowing south. And on the ground, again, my perspective is talking to cab drivers in Mexico City and Monterrey and Acapulco. They're saying that these factories that used to make legitimate products are now storing these arms that came from the north. So I think your point is a very good one. As far as what are we seeing for accurate and actual numbers, I have no idea where to begin. I couldn't even hazard a guess, and I think that's probably the most realistic story, since they didn't disclose it and they don't know.
On the border, anecdotally, the flow started to go down, actually, the more it became public. And there was bigger guns for drugs trade from, up through, say, 2008, 2009. And then once the problem became more publicly addressed by the U.S. government, there's been, the flow has decreased slightly. Again, but this is border anecdotes. I can't give real hard numbers. I'm skeptical that it's as serious a problem on the ground as it is politically. I think that there's just as much flow from other sources as there is from the United States.
Yeah, and to pick up on Dave's point, as I suggested, with drugs being a demand-side problem, I think arms are a demand-side problem. As long as there's a demand and a boatload of cash in Mexico, they will get weapons. If the weapons come from the United States right now, it's because it's easy. If that gets hard, there's plenty of weapons routes coming from the south through Colombia or Venezuela, right? They can come by sea from any of the vast stores of arms that are sitting overseas. I mean, people in Afghanistan don't have trouble getting weapons, and if you can get it in Afghanistan, you can get it to Karachi, and if you can get it to Karachi, it's on a boat and it can go wherever. So as long as there's demand and money, this will be a problem. We could build the mythical Minutemen border wall or force field, and it's still going to be a problem for that simple reason.
My name's Priya Sathi. I'm a SIPA student. My question is sort of on the economic perspective results that's influencing the security industry in both the U.S. and Mexico. In terms of your clients, the control risk clients, and also the economic industries in Monterrey, how much is they're contracting U.S. businesses for security consulting? So they're contracting for defense equipment, security equipment, surveillance equipment, this sort of industry that is sort of popping up as a result of the violence and security situation in Mexico. If you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Now, before you walk away, Priya, I guess my question is, you want to know what the average company is spending or what the need is
Well, what the need is. So like
Yeah,
companies
sure.
like Pemex is really, and there are a lot of the huge industries in Monterey, they're the ones contracting because they're getting targets of kidnapping and extorting.
Yep.
And how much are the railroad industries building up their sort of equipment and stuff?
Yeah, sure. So we don't do anything with guns. So we're not a security consultancy that's going to provide you with folks that that are physically armed and can protect your employees.
I'll say it for John. They're not Z or Blackwater or Saracen.
Thank you. So what we're seeing primarily is how do you develop the infrastructure at your plant. Here's an anecdote. Back in almost a year ago, so last May, there was this operation that had a couple hundred employees working. 30 or 40 militants show up with AK-47s, RPGs, and heads and other body parts. And it was show of force, hey, get out of here. We want to take your infrastructure. We want to take your building, and we want to use it for us. The employees all fled, naturally so. So what are they doing now? It's trying to make that target harder. So it's reducing your exposure. So instead of flying, the flag, saying this is who we are, they want to go to an environment where they don't necessarily know what they're making in there, and they're not the hardest target. The other stuff that we're seeing, executive protection tasks. So, vice president from Houston, San Diego, Minneapolis comes into town. He wants to know who's going to pick him up at the airport, what's his itinerary going to be, when's he going to get out, and he wants to make sure that it's done safely. Other stuff where really my focus is helping organizations put a process in place, so developing a crisis management structure, because they don't know what's going to happen. Right. So, the problem that their friend had to deal with last week is not the problem they're going to deal with tomorrow. It's going to be something different. Some kind of permutation of what they had to deal with. So developing some kind of flexible structure to put in place so that they can respond to almost anything. And they have a plan. If it hits the fan, what are they going to do? Because they're not going to stop operating there. There's too much financial incentive to continue to operate in Mexico. Did that answer your question? And again, I can't begin to guess.
No, that's
if
it. It's sort of that way. Not so much as in personal security, but also the equipment, the sort of industry that's popping up that like these major companies in Mexico and also their industries are looking to protect themselves. It's just the economic results of this sort of action.
I think it's more an educational thing than a physical preparedness. It's not to say that they're not doing the infrastructure stuff, but I think they're probably putting more money into educating their employees.
Okay.
Just one caveat on that. The Monterey Chamber of Commerce has officially, they've recommended that businesses double the percentage of operating cost budget that they're spending on security infrastructure and security issues.
Okay.
That's an interesting question. So did they have a number to start with? Like, was the average 6% and they're saying go to 12?
It averaged 1% and they've taken it to 3%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is smaller than I had expected. But,
Yeah. But still, tripling.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Neumann. I'm an associate of the University Seminar on Latin America here at SIPA. I'm also Venezuelan, and I lecture and write a lot about Latin American politics and Chavez, who is a bit of a thorn in my side. But anyway, as I said, I'm Venezuelan. I was on the phone with my brother in Caracas last night, who was telling me about the virtual kidnappings. Like, you don't understand. Now it's not, the problem is not just Chavez. I think we care less about Chavez than we do about crime and violence. It's so unbearable. I don't go out of my house past 8 p.m., and he's young. He's, and he was saying, and I know, as of a few years ago, since Chavez has been in power, we've had 8 times more kidnappings, 3 times more likely to be murdered. I think those numbers have now, just from when he took power to now. I have my own theories about the link between violence and the erosion of institutional independence and governance. That's me. What do you think? Do you have any views about, because you were talking about Plan Colombia, and, well, you didn't mention Plan Patriota, but also, the sort of knock-on to the counterinsurgency, that in Colombia you had a good political structure and the will, so that signals to me that you do view a link as between violence in these countries and the political structure. I'd want to hear your views on it.
So, I mean, specifically for kidnapping, where governance fails, the business model is going to be beneficial until they start prosecuting the people that are perpetrating these kidnappings. I don't see any end in sight. For Venezuela specifically, we're not seeing that. And I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, but folks on the ground, when I speak to them, they do think that law enforcement is complicit in not only express kidnappings, but the kidnap for ransom. I will say, from my own personal experience, I think Venezuela is a tremendous country, and it just, my heart aches when I go there. It's the only city I've been into in the world, Caracas is, where I don't feel comfortable going out at night. And it's just that, you know, that sense that you get. And it also helps when the locals say, oh yeah, I know someone that's been kidnapped. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
And, you know, parents are legitimately concerned when their 19, 20, 23-year-old sons and daughters are going to go out to a nightclub and they're going to get picked up on their way home. So I think it's absolutely tragic. But the sense that I'm getting from the perspective on the ground is I think the general consensus is folks are skeptical of any kind of police force that's going to combat, you know, particularly the kidnapping problem in Caracas or Maracaibo or Venezuela at large. And I think many probably think that they are complicit in them.
Okay. Do you think that is that in any way tied to who's president?
I mean, to your point about institutions, absolutely. I mean, I sort of alluded to this earlier. Much of the problem with violence, whether it be, at least in my perception, in Latin America or in Iraq and Afghanistan, is an issue of political dynamics. It's not necessarily a shortage of trigger pullers. And so what you've seen, my perception, I'm not a Latin Americanist by training, but my perception is the Chavez regime has systematically hollowed out both Venezuelan state and society. And, you know, to my mind, it looks like not quite as extreme, but a similar dynamic to what Saddam Hussein did in Iraq over the course of the 1980s and 1990s. And you end up with an overweening state that is nonetheless not terribly effective. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing in Venezuela.
Because it's too much of a cult of personality, or what?
Not so much cult of personality. It's because loyalty is paramount. Loyalty not only to a specific leader, but to the state apparatus. And you know, in every case where you see loyalty prized over competence, the organization, or indeed the entire state, becomes a hollow shell at best. And you know, you can point to example after example, be it South Vietnam in the 1970s, where despite loads of aid, I mean absolutely the most military aid we've given any country in the world, you couldn't produce an effective army. Why? Because South Vietnamese people won't fight? No, it's because the state that it was based on was this loyalty promoting, you know, semi-kleptocracy. And I think anywhere you see those conditions, like, oh, by the way, Afghanistan now, you're going to have a hard row to hoe in terms of providing security. And it doesn't have to be a full-blown insurgency, and it clearly isn't yet in Venezuela or Mexico, but it still creates an environment where, with the lack of institutions, be it courts, be it public service, be it police, it creates this environment where lawlessness is going to abound.
Well, exactly. I mean, we have the death rates of a country in a civil war.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely.
the same death rates.
I mean, worse than some.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the numbers I've seen suggest that you're more likely to be killed in Caracas than you are in Kabul, right?
Yeah.
And that's a country that's in a full-blown
more than
war.
Baghdad, certainly. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you.
I felt safer in Ramadi in 2007 than I did in Ciudad Juarez in 2009.
Yeah.
To your point about the politics.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Though to
Thank
be
you. And I, by the way, I thought that your point about loyalty over competence was a very good one. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And though, to be fair, in Ramadi in 2007, you did have the full weight of the U.S. Marine Corps backing you up. I feel pretty warm and fuzzy when I have that too, no matter where I am.
Two other, before we get on to this next question, just what concerns me, and it's not an answer, it's more a question, and I want to know your senses. We have, it seems to me, just based on Venezuelans that I know, that because of the political system, many of them are leaving. It seems like the country's getting robbed of its intellectual elite that are opting to come to the States. They're going to Miami or New York or Bogota. So I wonder, from your perspective as an academic that studies this, if this is a valid point. And then two, what I'm seeing, and this is more just a point, I'm seeing hesitance from multinational organizations to operate in Venezuela. They're getting to the point where they're building expropriation plans. So what do I do, hopefully, to prevent getting expropriated? But if I do, what's my reaction? And they're spending a lot of money to develop these plans. So they're getting to the point where they're saying, I'm not going to operate in Venezuela. Rather than go to Venezuela, I'm going to go to Colombia or I'm going to go to Brazil. And I think I can do business better there. From an academic standpoint, my question to you is, are either of those valid?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are valid points. In fact, the other conversation I was having with my brother was about immigration, about possibly leaving contingency plans to leave Venezuela. He loves Venezuela very much, lives there, doesn't want to leave. Is far more Venezuelan, has spent more of his life there than I have. But he says, well, we need to have an exit strategy. And so I'm helping him with that. Part of the problem is why people are leaving is because also a lot of my friends have been, almost everybody I know has either been kidnapped or shot. Many of my friends have either been thrown in prison for speaking out against the government or had their property seized. And it's rampant. It's growing more and more. I mean, I know dozens of people. So there is a sense of sort of legal nihilism where basically the state basically operates at the will of what you say loyalty, that if you're loyal to the regime or to the apparatus, then you're okay, but if not, then you're persecuted. And as I said, I know many people, close people who have been persecuted. So so that's one, that is one aspect. But there's also a sense in Venezuela, and I know in my mind also, that the two are not disconnected. That the sense of that, like, they're coming to get you, also somehow has also created the environment for this lawlessness, where it's either the government might come and get you, or you're just going to be, shot in a restaurant, and that by just some guy on the street. But what I'm trying to do is to sort of connect the dots, and that I was wondering how you guys, the practitioners, saw that. And yes, in terms of expropriations, yeah, they're growing, and and I think something like, I just got the numbers by email, something like 80% of the expropriations are now failed. I used to try and promote business in Venezuela when I worked at the embassy in Washington, D.C. many lifetimes ago. And I couldn't see doing that job now. Yeah. I really don't know why you would invest in Venezuela unless you can sort of afford to lose that money. It's like that portion of your portfolio that you just give to Madoff or something.
Zero it out. Thank you. I'm Brad Jennison, senior at undergrad. My question is, from the security standpoint, I guess it would be directed at John. What level, is there a baseline level of security in which people are not getting kidnapped? And I know that's going to be relative to your status, position, and how much you make. But are guys running 3-car motorcades through Mexico City still at risk of getting kidnapped? Or if you're making less than that and you've got one driver, are you mitigating some of that risk?
Yeah. I'll say it's mostly opportunistic. So the vast majority of what we're seeing, it's a lot of times it's user error. So it's 2 a.m. And they're pulling out their bank card, and they're standing outside an ATM, and they're pulling a bunch of money out, and then they're getting nabbed. And they've been drinking for the last 6 or 7 hours. We're seeing much of that. Executive types are driving. They're hiring 4, 5, 6 individuals to protect them and drive them in a motorcade. But there's this really interesting dynamic that I think you see when you're in DF, and you see these 16 and 17-year-old kids. Like, they look like babies, and they're driving in their Ferraris. I mean, I think what's really interesting in DF is there's so much money in that city, and folks, it's almost like they just whistle past the graveyard and like, oh, it can't happen to me. So I guess my answer is it's mostly opportunistic. The folks that are proactive are not generally getting picked up. Doesn't mean that it's not ever happening, but I'll say most of the time that's the answer I'm sticking with. Yeah.
I'm a business student here. I have two questions here. One is, what is the, just now you mentioned the institutional erosion. So what is the root cause for such an institution, for the erosion of the institutions? And the second one is, it seems to me that in the past 20 years, maybe, the violence in Latin America has accelerated. But can you give us a comparison about what about maybe before 1990? Because we know before that time, the economic Latin America actually experienced the economic miracles, and at that time, economic situation was very was good, and but after that, then the economic situation deteriorated. So, do you contribute the increasing violence in Latin America to the deterioration of economic situations in these countries, or particularly in Mexico? Thank you.
I wouldn't attribute it to the continuing violence in Mexico. I would say it's cyclical in the sense that to the earlier points about Venezuela, the political institutions throughout Mexico and the security institutions throughout Mexico are not capable of and have not maintained the growth that the economic institutions did in a fairly short period of time. And I think, unfortunately, all the trends continue downward when we're talking about how quickly those institutions are going to catch up. Does that answer your question, or is it?
Thank you.
I have a couple of thoughts on root causes. I think it varies from place to place. In Venezuela, I'll sound like a Chavez basher, but that's fine. I think it's pretty clearly tied to.
I'm more interested in Mexico because
in Mexico, I think Mexico has always been a fairly weak state, relatively speaking. I mean, now I'm going to get into pure speculation, but the United States was a weak state for a long time, and we went through a variety of experiences that built up state power. We had the Articles of Confederation that became the Constitution because of some uprisings, amongst other things. We then had a civil war, which greatly accelerated the growth of state power. We had a depression. We had World War II. We had all of these things that were solved in a way by the growth of state capacity. Now, some people, including my own libertarian self, bemoan this a little bit, but it did produce a pretty effective state. Now, we may be seeing problems with it now in terms of the democratic consensus breaking down, but nonetheless, you saw this progression. Mexico, to my mind, and again, I'm not a Latin Americanist, so if you think I'm full of shit, please raise your hand. Oh, I'm sorry, we're recording this. I shouldn't say that. But nonetheless, the Mexican state, despite on paper being quite powerful, I think in practice has been relatively weak. It went through a series of sort of spurts of growth at various times, and Pemex, paradoxically, I think, actually contributed to this. Because when you have oil money, you can be a bit of a rentier state, right? You don't have to build up your extractive capacity, and you see a lot of flabbiness in these kind of states. Norway and the UK are sort of exceptions, in part because they had pretty robust states before they found oil. So that's your off the shoot from the hip hypothesis on why Mexico. And then, so you have this relatively weak state that then encounters a massive influx of illegal money, right? And so it's well, the analogy I want to use would be impolitic, given the recent events in Japan. But it's a big flood of money into an area that's not very well prepared for it. I think that's really the story of Mexico. Again, I think the dynamic is different from country to country. In terms of the economics bit, I think it is a little bit of a misperception to say that overall violence has gone up in Latin America. The character of the violence has changed. The places it takes place has changed, Mexico being the singular example. But Latin America was a pretty violent place before 1990 as well. You had a raging civil war. I mean, Colombia is probably, as Dave pointed out, and John both, it's probably gotten a little better in the past few years. El Salvador was in the middle of a horrible civil war, and violence levels in that country are only now starting to get back up to that level. Guatemala had decades of absolutely murderous, near genocidal civil war. So I think what you've seen is a change in the character of the violence and where it takes place, more than, you know, you could maybe look at absolute levels and figure it out. But I think it's a little misperception to say before 1990, all good in Latin America, after 1990, not. But clearly, I think there are links to economic growth that have changed the character. But it's hard to tease out which is which. You know, in Chile, you've seen economic growth, but did it lead to the reduction in violence there, or was it because the nature of the state changed? I think it's the latter, and these things were a bit disconnected. I'm rambling.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Polner, and I'm president of Cinema Verite International, Inc. My question basically is related to connecting dots of violence. There has been, and you may not have an answer for this, but there has been talk that Gaddafi, if he flees, may go to Venezuela, and that Chavez would open the door to him. Of course, wherever he goes, he would bring millions with him. Do you see any likelihood for that? You have any information on that? And again, thank you.
You guys have
I don't think we have anything on that specifically. Certainly, it seems plausible given that the relationship that the guys have, but you know, I don't have any additional information on that.
No,
I don't have anything either.
No,
but certainly,
insight.
but certainly
with
plausible. I mean, dictators
Yeah.
have to find some place to go, and it just depends on who their friends are. So
But he would bring billions with him.
It would be consistent with Chavez's track record.
Yeah.
I think.
would.
But
we could all
that's why I
agree.
say plausible, but I couldn't say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I actually have a couple of questions, and if you think of more, we've got probably 10 minutes left. But two that I was interested in that I'm a little surprised didn't come up. One is, what do you see the potential for flow of some of these trends up into the United States, crossing from Mexico into at least, you know, maybe beyond the immediate border, but into the broader, those 4 states you mentioned that border Mexico. And the second, you know, one of the reasons I wanted you guys here is you do have an Iraq-Afghanistan perspective that I think a lot of people that work in Latin America don't have. And so maybe you could have any thoughts on similarities, differences, anything you see that carries over from the two.
Well, I'll address the first question. I'm going to let him tackle the problem north, but we have seen a flow south. So what we've seen in the first, almost April now, going back to the fall, is we've seen the Zetas as a new alliance joined in Mexico. We've seen the Zetas start to operate in Guatemala. I really don't know about any kind of flow northbound, but we have seen that.
Most of the Texas-Mexico border is privately owned land. Most of the border west of El Paso is public land. El Paso statistically is the 3rd safest city in the United States, and obviously Ciudad Juarez is, if not the murder capital of the world, at least one of the top. It's competing with Caracas as the murder central for the Western Hemisphere. I think the trending is that Arizona has been a problem since those of you who studied the U.S.-Mexico border or U.S.-Mexico relations in detail, or raise your hand if you've heard of Operation Gatekeeper in anybody in California that began to move the flows of illegal immigration and illegal trafficking into Arizona. The trafficking north through Arizona is strong enough that in many of the national forests where the United States has just placed signs that say, warning, smuggling taking place here, and does not have the capacity or the infrastructure to maintain a regular border patrol presence, smugglers are actually able to set up patrol bases, and they've been able to do this for the past decade, where they can set up a patrol base flowing north and then, you know, set it up, move cargo, pull it back. And they started doing that in the mid to late 90s, and because they've been consistently successful with it, that's, I think, going to be, you know, and again, most of this is outside of public view, but it is one of the reasons why Arizona as a state has had many of the political issues that they've had because ranchers see this on a day-to-day basis, and or if not on a daily basis, on a consistent enough basis that nobody in Arizona who lives within 70 or 80 kilometers of the U.S.-Mexico border doesn't have a dog, and usually a weapon.
So you don't want to touch the Iraq-Afghanistan one, either one of you?
I'll tackle it. Latin America, in my experience, is not a war zone. When I went to Iraq and flew into Baghdad International, it was occupied by Allied forces. That's not the case when I fly into Mexico City or Caracas or Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo or Buenos Aires. And until it's there, I think the best thing to tell people is try to mitigate the risk, but you can certainly operate in Latin America.
The lawlessness of Latin America, though, is troubling, and I think so most of my time, and we can talk. We're running short, but I spent a lot of time traveling alone. I was placed under surveillance twice, and I can talk about the details of that at different points. Generally, one of the times I was on my way across the U.S.-Mexico border, so it wasn't as big of a deal. The other time it was enduring for a couple of days, and I ended up changing clothes once I realized what the problem was. To make a long story short, I was believed to be a Mennonite hitman. A Mennonite hitman. There was a...
Oh, wait a minute. A Mennonite hitman.
A Mennonite hitman.
So you drove like a black car and were wearing
No,
black clothes
I travel generally in by bus in Latin America. That's been, in my experience, the easiest way to maintain a low profile. Unfortunately, again, to make a very long story short, I was in a city called Cuauhtemoc in western Chihuahua. That's right off of, there's a train that runs from Los Mochis up to Chihuahua City. It's through an area called the Barrancas del Cobre, which is the Copper Canyon. It's beautiful. It's the largest canyon in North America. It's even, I see a nod, it's even slightly larger than the Grand Canyon. But there's a rivalry there, as I learned, between the Tarahumara Indians and there's a group of Old Colony Mennonites that live in and around the city of Cuauhtemoc, which is about 2 hours west of the capital of Chihuahua City. Both groups are involved in drugs. Let's just say I looked a lot like a Mennonite when I was going through the Tarahumara Indian area, and they weren't too happy about me being there. I had people watching me for a couple of days. It took me a while to figure this out. Once I got to Cuauhtemoc, I realized that not all the Mennonites were doing the Lord's work. And I changed into jeans and a Yankees cap, and I was good.
Oh, my.
Sorry to take again the...
You have to be quick, though.
Yeah,
one person behind you in 5 minutes.
in Central America, a quick anecdote. A couple of weeks ago, I was flying back from San Francisco to JFK, and my cellular, which was stolen at the San Francisco airport by the cargo handlers, and I was able to discover that they were able to make some telephone calls to Honduras. That doesn't necessarily mean that the guys, that there is a Honduras, a Catrachos mafia at the San Francisco airport. But my point is, are there international links between with the U.S. gangs, L.A. gangs, in particular, between the Maras in Honduras and El Salvador, and I don't know how they call them in Guatemala, but basically it's the same notion of gangs that have are in crime. And actually, a related question. Bless you. To what extent the problem of crime in Central America was compounded by the informal, so to speak, expulsion of gang members from El Salvador, in particular, in the late 90s.
To your first question, a big connection between prison gangs, particularly La M, the Mexican mafia, and
And
the- and the
US-based
Maras.
gangs.
Yeah, and I think the same thing. I mean, again, I live in Washington, D.C., so that's where my knowledge comes from. But folks that say that they have links back to the Maras in Salvador and Honduras. So I don't think that you're wrong, but I can't say without a shadow of a doubt that I have any kind of proof that you're right.
I'll be a little more definitive, at least on Salvador, again, just because I've been there a good bit lately. It's a pretty clear link. And in fact, there's a hierarchy. And in an interesting sort of turnabout of how the Sicilian mafia worked, the Maras in the United States are actually higher status than Maras in Salvador. So if you go from being a Mara in San Salvador to a Mara in LA, even if you were a lieutenant in Salvador, you're demoted to basically, back to street sort of tough. If you go from the U.S. down to Salvador, you're automatically a lieutenant, even if you were just like, a pipe hitter on the street. So there is a link, and the hierarchy is a bit inverse of how it normally worked. And that's because the Maras grew up in the States, right? So the States are actually more the home to the Maras than Salvador. So to your second point, yeah, the time to go home boys thing in the 1990s, I mean, there weren't really Maras to speak of. I mean, there was violence, but it was not Mara activity in the same way until Maras from the United States went back to Salvador. So I can't speak to Guatemala or any other places like that, but definitely with Salvador there are links, and the U.S. branches are the senior branches. Last question.
I think part of my question, but real quick, to piggybacking on the Mara situation, but we talked about geography in Mexico. How much do the trains have anything to do with the violence and the migration that goes through Mexico coming up from Central America? And we talked about proximity to the U.S., just the migration effect and immigration through Mexico into the United States. How much is that affecting the violence? And then also, specifically with Guatemala, because I know a little bit more about Guatemala, but just in general, like Mano Dura in El Salvador, Honduras, but in Guatemala specifically, the private security firms that have started to come up that are better armed than the police forces, when we have these, try to support them from the United States perspective to build up their police force, how can we deal with these private security firms that are already there and people have already bought into, and how does that lend itself to, like you said, the violence in Central America now is not that bad. It's not a war zone, but at the same time, everyone seems to have their own little army, so maybe that's why it doesn't seem like a war, even though it kind of is.
All three great questions. I think we could probably do a conference or seminar on each of them.
All right, I'll invite you back.
But to your first one, as far as the trains, just an interesting anecdote about it. The train system and the train infrastructure in Mexico used to be much more robust than it currently is. Post-NAFTA in the 90s, for a number of reasons, the Mexican government determined that it was more profitable to invest heavily in busing infrastructure, and Mexico actually has one of the most robust bus systems and national bus systems in Latin America. I do think certainly the anecdotes that you have for Guatemala in terms of the flows coming up in the train, yes, it is an issue.
Just to touch on the private security thing, it is an issue. I don't really have a good answer, but certainly, again, I keep going back to Salvador just because I've been there. Yeah, you can't go anywhere really to speak of without there being an armed guard, at least nearby. The only other place that's not an active war zone I've been where you see that was in Pakistan in Islamabad, where even the furniture store had a guy with a shotgun out front. So San Salvador is not quite to that level. And I guess I should be clear when I say that I am talking San Salvador. If you go even a little bit outside of the capital, things get a lot better for sort of weird reasons. I mean, one of the interesting things about Salvador is that the areas that were insurgent held during the 1980s tend to be the safest bits in terms of crime. And so, again, you could probably have a whole conference on the dynamics that led to that. But in San Salvador, there's a lot of private security. Every self-respecting condo complex has some kind of patrol that comes by frequently. It's what people do in response to these kind of situations. If there's state failure, something will fill that vacuum. And if it's not crime, which a lot of it is, I mean, every pupuseria is paying tribute to the Maras. I mean, that's not a joke. I mean, you can see little old ladies making their dough, and sometime that day somebody will come by and get paid off. But the other response is, okay, the state has failed me. I don't want to be victimized by criminals. You know, I'll go with option C if I can, and that's what you've seen, I think, in San Salvador, and we'll probably see in other parts of of Latin America. Mexico, I think, is a little different because, you know, as I said, it's weird because you have a state that is on paper pretty strong, and so will probably be pretty resistant to, you know, massive numbers of armed contractors, but at the same time, the state isn't willing to provide security in the same way either. So you get these weird dynamics where, you know, you have a state that will push back against alternative centers of power, but isn't able to actually do its job. It's kind of, I suspect Venezuela will be the same way. So at least in Salvador, you have that private option in a way that you don't in other places. I don't know, what do you guys think? Nobody's going to fight me today. All right, well, the last thing to do then is to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for attending. So.